Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. It's Friday and I've finished my work for the week. Working on too many projects at once, but I've come through and now it's Saturday coming. Saturday's tomorrow, it's the weekend, and I'm gonna read all day Saturday is what I'm saying. This is my shelf of favourite kids books, I guess, in the nicest editions that I've got, and I thought I'd talk you through what's on this shelf, some of the things on this shelf, without making everything fall down. The St. Michael book of Over the Rainbow, Tales of Fantasy and Imagination. That cover is just so evocative. It belongs to a certain era of kids' books, I'd say kind of early 80s. This has got some lovely excerpts in, really well chosen actually. It includes a section of The Marvellous Land of Oz. Anybody choosing bits of books who decides that the best bit of Oz to include is the bit where they strap two settees together and give it a moose's head and make it fly, and all the characters get on board. That section from The Marvellous Land of Oz, that's somebody who knows what they're talking about. Or who from Tolkien chooses the Riddles in the Dark section of The Hobbit. And then includes these wonderful illustrations. It's a really smashing book, and one that I didn't have when I was a kid. It was one that I discovered many years afterwards. Somewhere there's a science fiction equivalent, and I've got it somewhere, and I can't find it. What else is here? I've mentioned this before, The Ghost on Saturday Night, which was a Scholastic favourite from the book club when I was a kid, and I found this hardback many years later. Whoops, Beverly Cleary's Dear Mr. Henshaw. Again, a book that I didn't know as a kid, that I discovered, I don't know when, in my 40s maybe. It's about a kid who writes to an author. It's about author visits to schools, basically, and authors when they are real people and they don't let you down when you meet them. Lee has been Boyd Henshaw's #1 fan ever since his second grade teacher read aloud Ways to Amuse a Dog. Now in the 6th grade, Lee lives with his mother and is the new kid in school, troubled by the absence of his father, a cross-country trucker, and angry because a mysterious lunch bag thief steals all the good stuff from his lunch. Lee feels his only friend is Mr. Fridley, the school custodian. Then Lee's teacher assigns a project that requires writing letters, asking questions of authors. Naturally, Lee chooses to write to Mr. Henshaw, whose surprising answer changes Lee's life. What else? I wish I had the cover for this. It had a dust jacket with a very scary monster on the front. This is the John Pertwee Book of Monsters from, when's this, 78. This did the rounds of our school library and everybody took this home at some point. It's one of the ones with this particular generation of writers who seem to write for everything. All the Armada books of monsters and science fiction and ghosts. The stories in here by both Catherine Gleason and Roger Mallison. I believe all the same person. In fact, from what I remember, they were both two women who wrote together, two young women, and they wrote for all these anthologies, and their stories are among the best to look out for. And this retelling of The Lambton Worm is one of the best. Flavio and the Cats of Rome by Pamela Binns is a really lovely kids book from the 70s, published by Grasshopper Books, who I've talked about before. A really interesting publisher who translated a lot of European and world kids books into English and did these nice editions. This was a book that, as soon as I finished reading it in 2020, I started reading it again immediately, which rarely happens. There's my copy of Mary Poppins, the Collins hardback from, oh, I don't know when. These are kind of, umpteenth, if that's a word, reprints. But I like having them in these nice editions. All my copies, come on Socks, jump up. All my copies are reading copies. Oop, running out of battery. And that's important to me. I don't want books that are kept in plastic on the shelves. I know people do that and that's their thing, but it's not mine. I love the illustrations in Mary Poppins. And all that lovely blank space around the margins and the gutters. Come on. Come and see everyone on the camera. It's lunchtime, that's the thing. Here's my copy of Anne of Green Gables. Not a very fancy one. Not really. It's Wordsworth editions, which, although I think they are quite fancy, because they've got nice big print and hardcovers. This was a couple of years ago. No, I think Wordsworth editions should be applauded, because for years they've done paperback copies that cost £1, and now these ones cost £3 or £4. It's what I keep saying, it's pocket money prices, and that's what books should be, especially kids' books. I really like Anne of Green Gables. I've read that umpteen times, and it's one of the books I turned to during lockdown, interestingly enough, as a consoling read, a reassuring read, which is, these are useful things to have on hand, and I guess that's why I've got this shelf right by my reading chair. Now here's a collection from '83, Constellations by Malcolm Edwards, edited by Malcolm Edwards. I'm sure I've talked about this before. It has the best collection of short stories I've seen in one place, I think, ever. And I've seen some collections, I've seen some well-chosen collections, but this is particularly good. 1980, in fact. It includes Philip K. Dick's Beyond Lies the Wub, which is probably my favourite short story. It also has Kurt Vonnegut's Harrison Bergeron, a very satirical science fiction story about a future in which nobody is allowed to excel and people have to be mediocre at everything for fear of showing off, so that ballet dancers weigh themselves down with sandbags, and anybody with a beautiful speaking voice who does voiceovers for TV is sacked, and instead they hire people with speech impediments. It's a very interesting story that I'm not sure they would anthologize nowadays. Interestingly. This is a lovely book. Kenneth Grahame's First Whisper of the Wind in the Willows. It includes his letters to his kids, and is really about the genesis of the Wind in the Willows. And shows how books arrive out of a life. When I flick through these things, when I'm talking about them, I find my little asterisks on pages, and I have to look back to see what I was talking about. There's a description here of Kenneth Grahame by, I don't know, who's this by then, this bit? This must be the introduction, a long introduction. But the fella writing it says, Kenneth Grahame, when he meets him at the station, about 50 years of age, his hair was white, but his face was almost beatifically young, and he had the clear and roseate complexion of a healthy child. He was dressed in knickerbockers, a soft shirt, a baggy coat of tweeds. One could see at a glance that he was one of those rare people in the world who look like themselves. I felt a desperate necessity, to say something unimportant, and I told him how the rhythm of the railway wheels had churned his long address within my mind to jiggery. I wonder who writes this bit. I love that idea. One of the rare people in this world who looks just like himself. I suppose, again, that's about meeting authors, isn't it? You've imagined how people are in your mind. There's a card in there from my friend Nick. And they turn out to look just like themselves and to be just like themselves. The rat-a-tat-tat. Whoops. The rat-a-tat-tat mystery. Enid Blyton. Can there be a better start to a book? Look at that. With that spot illustration of a mantelpiece and holly. Chapter 1, Christmas Holidays. How long do these Christmas holidays last? Said Mr. Linton, putting his newspaper down as a loud crash came from upstairs. I sometimes think I'm living in a madhouse. I can't remember if I read this as a kid or not. Somebody mentioned it a few years ago, and I had to go and find it. It's one of her, obviously, mystery books, the Rat-a-Tat Mystery. I loved The Famous Five, and I loved The Faraway Tree. I'm not sure how many of the others I read. Some of these seemed old-fashioned at the time. The Famous Five they could update and make it seem as if it was happening in the 1970s when I was a kid. Some of the others belonged very firmly to the 30s or 50s, and that was one of them. And I obviously don't mind it when you grow up. The Cricket in Times Square by George Selden, which I've talked about before, and this is my nice hardcover edition. Replacing my Puffin, which fell to pieces just about. I've still got it, but it's almost in pieces. This is a lovely series of books. Very eccentric animal books set in and around New York. I really like them. I love George Selden as a writer. He wrote The Genie of Sutton Place as well, which is a great kids' book. There's my copy of the first Nancy Drew, a facsimile edition, of course, and I've got mostly my copies are Armada paperbacks of the 70s, but it's nice to have at least one in this particular kind of yellow hardbacks. I didn't get round to reading my Halloween Nancy Drew at Halloween, which is a shame. This edition of The Snow Queen is something I got as a teenager and has followed me everywhere. And I read it most Christmases. It's really eerie. I'll be talking more about Christmas books, obviously, in the next month or so. Happily. I could talk forever about Christmas books, and I would talk about them all year round if I could. This is the kind of first inkling of that. Something happens in these illustrations to do with two-dimensional things becoming 3D, or different planes of existence crossing over one into the next. It's very interesting. The Snow Queen is and the flattening of distance. The Snow Queen is such a strange story anyway, involving nested stories, one inside the next. The way Hans Andersen organises it has always kind of beguiled me, and I'm not sure I understand it all yet, really. Yeah. This kind of weird thing of distance and the foreshortening of distance happens throughout these illustrations. I think it's a lovely edition of this. The drawings are by, I can't even say that, Stasis Hydrovicius, possibly. I don't know where it came from. It must be, I don't know, Eastern European maybe. I'm not sure. Anyway, talked about this. Whoops, I keep knocking us down. Talked about this when I found it. These, what's the name of the publisher? Corgi did the paperbacks, but these James Blish books based on Star Trek, the original show. And they still smell like Darlington Library, like Aycliffe Library, like libraries in the early 80s. This is the one that's got terrible graffiti at the back saying something extremely rude. That's my version of Star Trek. You can take all of your flashy TV shows and movies, but these paperbacks, for me, are where it really lives. I've talked a bit about this Francis Gappa's novel of 79, and I've talked about The Little House Christmas Treasury. I must have talked about Steps Out of Time. This is a different edition to the one that I treasure. It's a 1980 kids book that we read at junior school. My last months at junior school. And it's a very autumnal, spooky time travel story about a single parent family and a kid who can go forward in time every time the mist comes down. I've read it again and again. It taught me so much then about, it's a lovely cover actually, even though it's not the actual one. It's very evocative as well. It taught me so much about writing actually. Hard to quantify exactly what. We didn't finish it, and then we left junior school, and I had to go to the library in town to find a copy, to finish it, to find out what happens to this poor kid who's shuttling back and forth in time, trying to find somewhere to be happy. And by then I'd started the comp, which was big and confusing and dirty and a bit rough and a bit crappy really compared with junior school, which had been so progressive, and I'd felt like I was getting somewhere. I knew what I was doing. I was writing and drawing and all the important stuff, and then you get to the comp and you're treated like just everybody else, and everybody has the same stuff to do. I keep complaining about this as if I've never got over it, but I do remember it very clearly. And things like reading Steps Back in Time were, oddly enough, a link back to remembering who I was when reading these great kids' books made me realise what it was I want to do with my life. And at that point, that was when I was writing to Penguin books and Puffin books as a 9 and 10-year-old and sending them chapters of my kind of Roald Dahl-esque stories I was doing there. The Witch in the Broom Cupboard, Pierre Gripari. Talked about him before. I read him about 2017 for the first time. I came upon that book by coincidence, really. It's published by somebody nice. Oh yeah, Pushkin Children's Books, who always do nice things in translation again. And I came across that by accident, loved it, found out where he was writing about in Paris, and we went to visit and actually found the cafe where he used to sit and write. At least a cafe that occupies the same space in near the Sorbonne, in that kind of area. My copy of Little Women, which I didn't read until I was an adult. Again, you couldn't walk around, I've said it before, with girls' books in our town if you were a boy. I knew it from adaptations, like Anne of Green Gables or Little House. I knew them from the TV versions, which I'd watch with my mum. This is published by the Marshall Cavendish Great Writers series, which was in the mid to late 1980s. And it came with a magazine each week. And I remember collecting the early ones. It was just before I went to university. And it was things like Vanity Fair and Thomas Hardy books and Jane Austen. And the magazines were lavish and all about the writer and all about the writer's times. Then these really nice, perfect bound editions of the novels. And of course, I think I had a few months before I went to university, and I couldn't continue. I mean, not just because of the money. I think even then it was like £8 a week for these. It was the weight of them. I couldn't be at university with all these heavy hardbacks. because I couldn't even have a record player, although I did later. Because I was going backwards and forwards on the bus to college, and when I came home I'd have to get everything in my 1 or 2 big bags. So I had about 15 of my own books with me, and I had to stop collecting the great writers. You still see them turning up in places now. They're nicely done, they're nicely designed, and I love Louisa May Alcott. I've read a couple further on in the series. What I love about these kinds of stories, and it's true of a few books of that era and that type, they're family stories, and there's always one little girl in the family who is going to write the story of the whole family. She's the studious and clever one who's scribbling away in the corner. And that was always me as well. It's usually a girl in the books. It isn't in life. One of my Paddington books. I love the Paddington books. I've said that again and again, I know. Again, it's a bit like David Bowie or Doctor Who. Everybody knows Paddington now. They think they know what it's all about because the films are huge. The stories are much more low-key and wry, I think. And the Wombles, of course. And I have talked about all these recently. My Big Dougal Magic Roundabout Treasury by Eric Thompson. And the Woozies. Now, these were a TV show in the 70s that never gets talked about. It was Margaret Stewart Barry, and the books were illustrated beautifully by John Castle. I don't know what came first, TV or books. These tie in with the TV, but they still are vivid of their own account. Margaret Stewart Barry came from Darlington. She came from near, exactly where I came from and grew up. Didn't know that until many years later. She also wrote a series, also televised, called Simon and the Witch, which was fantastic as well. These are very... Socks! Come on. They're very funny. That's what they are. And this is the Woozies on television. The drawings are very, very inventive. And splashy. And acrylic-y. And very 70s. And again, there's something that have fallen out of the world completely. I had to dig around on eBay for these to appear. It's a shame, only certain things seem to survive into the future. We leave an awful lot behind. And part of my job as an enthusiast is to remind people of what is getting left in the past. Now, Barbara Ierson was a great anthologist and did lots of ghosty and spooky books. But the two that I've got here, and the other one's not here, are her time travel and fantasy stories. And the time travel one in particular is just about perfect from what I remember. Anything that has Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson, H.G. Wells and John Christopher, and Jack Finney, all in one book, has got to be worth looking at. The cat's gone off, and I can hear Jeremy padding around as well. He's going to try and get in on this video, I know it. Anyway, that will do for today. I've gone over time already. Next time, I might start talking about Christmas books. Is it too soon? Okay, see you again soon. Bye-bye.